Hello, everyone. I am Heather Herring, the Education Manager of the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, and I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. Today, we will hear about disposal capacity. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour of professional development credit if you complete the survey and request it during the live webinar. Webinars are recorded and made available for those who registered. Complete your learning with webinars all summer long, and visit our new website at nrrarecycles.org. For our recycling facility operators, we have webinars throughout the summer to choose from and learn. You can register online. And for our educators, administrators, and community members, we have webinars to share. Although I list these on 2 different slides, all webinars are open to all. I want to set the table for GoToWebinar. You will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants on GoToWebinar. If you cannot hear the presenters, click on audio and computer audio. If that does not work, try clicking on phone call and follow the directions. We hope you'll ask questions and the presenters will answer them if time allows. Click on questions and keep your questions short. Here's a bit about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. We are a recycling nonprofit. We have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were founded nearly 40 years ago. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs, and we have over 40 programs, including single stream and MSW, and we connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. We also provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, annual conferences and summer webinars like these, technical assistance, and school programs. And now I would like to introduce the panel of presenters today on disposal capacity. First up, we have Jeff Bourdeau, who is responsibilities of the Vermont Department of Conservation include the proper management of waste throughout Vermont. He's also responsible for permitting, construction, and review of the Coventry Landfill. Then we have John Fischer, who's Deputy Division Director of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And we have Mike Nork, who works in the Solid Waste Management Bureau of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And I'm now turning over the presentation to the panel. First, we're going to have Jeff Bourdeau speak. Welcome, Jeff.
Oh, welcome. Thank you, Heather. And thanks, NRRA, for giving me the opportunity to talk about Vermont's waste capacity. As I was putting this PowerPoint together, it made me think that it's not really Vermont's capacity, it's capacity within Vermont. And obviously, as I go through this, it's a private company, but we're grateful that they're operating in Vermont. And you'll see through my presentation that Vermont has a good sense of where our capacity is at and where we'll be in the future. So I think with that, you know, I just also say I've been working for the department since '92, and a lot what I'll be talking about today is the landfill, and I've been working at that landfill since that time. So if we can go to the next slide, Heather. And this would be my only joke, and now I can understand how the late night television hosts, how it's a silent world out there. But you all know where Vermont is, and so that's not what I'm trying to show here, but this is where I've traveled since COVID. But the point is, if you do look at Vermont and like all New England states, there's not a lot of, we're limited by Canada to the north, the Lake Champlain to the west, and then we have some of the larger populations to our south. And when I'm talking today, you'll see how that influences our waste capacity. So we can go to the next slide. I'll just give you a little snapshot of where Vermont's at. We've got 623,000 people, based on my Google search the other day. Vermonters produce about 500,000 tons of waste a year, and but the state takes in 532,000 tons a year. And if you look at that, that's not much difference from what we're producing and how much we're taking in compared to other states. It's pretty level at that point. And we have one landfill in Vermont, and it's expected to fill up. Its current operational status is the cell will be filling up October 2021. I put that down as kind of a shock and awe date there, but there's a good story coming up. One of the things, so these are all variables, but one thing that helps us predict our capacity in Vermont is we do only have one landfill. The waste movement across our borders, which I'll talk about in a minute, is limited, and our tracking is significant. We have several people that are watching this, and we do our yearly waste reports. But I'd have to say right now, our 2019 numbers aren't out, but we'll be working on 2018 numbers for this presentation. So on the next slide, it shows, demonstrates what Vermonters are, where their waste is going. And predictably, most of it's going right in the state of Vermont. So that's off to the right. And then we have New Hampshire. Some of our waste goes to New Hampshire and a little bit to New York. And those two areas are shipping to those areas is mostly from our southern towns, such as Brattleboro and Bennington. I know like Bennington's going over to Hoosick Falls and New Hampshire, so some is Wheelbrader and Bethlehem. Other things to note here is minor amounts go to Massachusetts. I suspect that's mostly like our e-waste and maybe HHW materials. But if we go on to the next slide, you can see what Vermont's importing. A little bit from Connecticut, almost what, 80, maybe 80,000, just above that from Massachusetts. A little bit from New Hampshire and not that much from New York. One of the things I'll talk about in a minute, maybe some of the reasons for Massachusetts is their disposal capacity, but also our highway infrastructure. And if you look at, one thing I want you to take note here is the types of materials that we're accepting from out of state. You'll see two missing items, which is MSW and C&D. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So most of these materials coming into the state are what we classify as special waste. And that special waste is waste that we approve on an individual basis for every project coming in. So I'll speak about that in a minute, but there's not like, I wouldn't say it's like an open border coming across on using our landfill capacities in Vermont. So why don't we just look at what we have available in Vermont. If you can go to the next slide. I took this photo. I thought it was I think it was a couple years ago, and it was a cold morning, and steam was rising off the heat of the landfill generating the heat. So it's New England Waste Services of Vermont. It's also known, formerly known as Waste USA. It's a subsidiary of Casella Waste Management. As I mentioned earlier, I've been involved with this landfill since '92. I think Casella bought it in '94 when the first line cell was being constructed. At present time, this facility is accepting about 532,000 tons of waste a year, and it's certified for 600,000 tons. If you can go to the next slide, just give a little location on this. I'm sure a lot of you know where this is located, but it's on the northern border of Vermont. The information here to gain from this is most of our population base is on the west coast of Vermont, which is Burlington, Middlebury, Rutland. The highway infrastructure to the landfill from Vermont communities is a bit difficult from where most of the waste is being generated, mostly secondary roads. But I want to point out that the landfill is located on a major highway network, which is 91. and 91, if you follow it down where it meets 89, which is White River Junction, 89 then continues down to Concord and into Boston. So from Boston, it's probably 220 miles, I think it is approximately, and then 3.5 hours of driving. The good news is, if you go to the next page, is that phase 4 is being constructed. This is it's located in the light blue, and it's approximately 51 acres. And when it's fully constructed, it will be about 13 million cubic, yeah, what do I have for a number there? It's covered, but it's 13 million cubic yards of airspace. You know, the previous in the gray is where they're operating now, and that was a 78 acre cell. So they started building this, or let me go back. In October 2018, they received certification for this. It's a 10-year certification, so they won't build out the entire 51 acres. But they received that certification and it was appealed. So that delayed construction until last summer, where they started rough excavation. And at this point right now, they're continuing to excavate, and they'll kind of back off through the winter. And next spring, they'll be lining. And by the fall of next year, they should be operating, ready to operate. If you go to the next slide, I took this photo a couple weeks ago, and just as we're looking at the phone, I'll just recapture how we can make great estimates on our capacity. So we know the capacity because it's one landfill. We know the waste stream with confidence. So the result is we can accurately predict our future capacity needs. And how do we have such a good idea on our capacity through not just volume, but years in advance? Is because of what I said earlier, is very little MSW is coming into Vermont from out of state, and little construction demolition debris. And how that happens is there's a state statute in the state of Vermont. If you can go to the next slide. Oops, I missed this. This is talking about if you're a MSW truck hauling into Vermont, this is the sign you see, but it's not welcoming you, it's welcoming the tourists. So what we know is MSW is banned from the other, I shouldn't say it's banned, but it's difficult to get in. And if you turn to the next page, I'll tell you why. We have state statute. If you read along there, it says that only waste can be deposited into the landfill that has an approved solid waste implementation plan from the secretary of our agency. So in order to get that approval, municipalities in Vermont must demonstrate that they have ongoing recycling, education programs, HHW collection events, leaf and yard waste collection, and e-waste. And then there's a few other items, but it's in a pretty extensive plan to create, and it's a substantial amount of time and effort. Vermont does have the opportunity to bring in waste from out of state, which is a special waste, which goes back to the C&D and those contaminated soils and other, where individuals can apply to the state of Vermont saying that there's special waste, which is uniform and consistent waste, which doesn't have, there will be knowledge that it wouldn't have recycling in or hazardous waste or any other types of waste. It's very uniform and consistent waste, which means like your asbestos materials, your special waste materials. Salesmen from Casella Waste Management are approaching these companies or generators down in the Massachusetts area, and giving them the opportunity to apply to their company for these materials, and they submit the analytical reports on the material. Casella then reviews those materials, and if it meets their approval, then they'll submit it to me personally, each project, and we'll go through and confirm that that we agree with those analyticals and they're allowed to take those materials in the state of Vermont. So what that does is it allows us to make a good estimate of the amount of materials coming up from other states because there's not a real spot market on MSW or C&D. It's just those materials aren't coming in. The photo I have included right below the condition that's in the permit is it's a picture from Arlington, Mass on Park Avenue. And this is my colleague, Buzz Sawillo. We went down this site this spring. And my point here is that we look at these sites closely, both the analyticals and occasionally we'll visit them. And the reason we do that is it gives the citizens of Vermont confidence that material coming to Vermont is clean and acceptable for our rules. It also gives credibility to us during permitting process and other times of meeting with the public that we are out there, we're looking at this material because probably like all citizens living local to landfills, the thought of waste coming from out of state, it doesn't go over well with them, but it gives us some type of, or not some type, but credibility. So knowing that we can't take MSW, or we're not taking much MSW or C&D from out of state, it gives us a great opportunity to give capacity numbers. So the next page gives us final capacity that I'm going to give for this talk, which is 13.7 million cubic yards, which converts based to about 24 years. And final date would be 2044. Obviously that can change. As I said at the beginning of this talk, that it's a private company. You know, we can't control what waste they could try to increase and look for spot markets, and or they could choose not to take Vermont waste, but that's where this landfill's capacity is. The NRRA also wanted me to address other capacities within the state. So if we go to the next slide, like all typical states, we have numerous facilities. These facilities have tonnage restrictions based on operations. We don't have the to make an a public need assessment in the state of Vermont for solid waste facilities. So our tonnage limitations are based on the operator's ability to operate the facility. So if they throw enough infrastructure and employees at a facility and they have the area to operate, the sky's the limit for tonnage. However, that's not really practical because we do know the limited service area, and these facilities operate within their tonnage limits. The ability, and this is my last slide, is the ability to go above these tonnage limits can happen if the governor of the state of Vermont declares a state of emergency. At that point, that's the next slide, yeah. This is Governor Scott with his race car. This photo was obviously taken before he became governor, as the sponsorship on the rear fender is familiar to us all. But if he declares a state of emergency, then all tonnage limits are off, both at the landfill and the local facilities. And that has happened in the past. The landfill didn't need that additional tonnage on a yearly basis, but on a daily basis, we had to open it up. And that occurred during Hurricane Irene. So that's the end of my presentation. I have the last slide if you want to just contact information. My boss years ago told me if I'd ever did a presentation outside of the state of Vermont that I need to include a cow in the presentation. So I couldn't really fit it in anywhere else. but I'll put it in the end. But the point is, just to reconfirm, emphasize, is that the state, we have the ability to make some really good estimates on our capacity. And I think right now Vermont's in a really good spot. And sorry, if construction continues as well as it is up at the landfill, it's cutting it close, but October 2021, we should be in pretty good shape. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for speaking to us about Vermont's disposal capacity, and I love the cow picture. So I wanted to transition just over to John Fischer from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. John, are you ready for your presentation?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great.
There you are.
Okay, so I'm going to give an overview of waste management capacity in Massachusetts. And I'm going to, most of my slides are going to draw from a study that was done for us a couple years ago by MSW Consultants. So I'll run through some summary slides from their study that I'll share with you. And then at the end, I'll put in a little bit about what's happening in Massachusetts in terms of policy issues related to management capacity. So if I can have the next slide, please. So back in 2018, as we were working on our 2020 to 2030 solid waste master plan, as part of the preparation for that work, we went out to bid for a study to analyze and assess and report on our overall management capacity, primarily within Massachusetts, but we also looked at some capacity in neighboring states and other states, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. So that was completed at the end of 2018. And that study reviewed all forms of management capacity. So that includes disposal capacity, both in-state and out-of-state, transfer capacity, C&D processing capacity, MRF capacity, compost and anaerobic digestion capacity, animal feed capacity, and even reuse capacity. So we wanted to look at all of those forms of management capacity available in Massachusetts, and I'll talk more about that thinking in a moment. And this study looked primarily at current levels, whatever the most recent available data was, but then also projected some qualitative changes and trends. So most of the slides and the rest of my presentation are drawn directly from the MSW Consultants report, but then I'll let you know when I'm shifting to my slides. So next slide. So these are the facility types that MSW Consultants surveyed and gathered data on. So again, it ranges from everything from disposal to transfer to processing capacities to even reuse capacity. So they attempted to identify all of these different forms of capacity. Next slide. There were some things that they didn't include, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but you know, we're really looking for things that are kind of are handling materials that would otherwise be in the waste stream, and we didn't go kind of too many steps away from that. So things that are kind of, you know, typically managed in other ways, we did not attempt to count all of these forms of capacity. So there are some things that are not included within the study. Next slide. So when we talk about the scope of the study, so of course they looked at capacity within Massachusetts, and then they also primarily looked at capacity within 30 miles of the Massachusetts border. The exception to that is that they also included any facility that was taking 5,000 tons or more of solid waste for disposal, which brings us to out-of-state capacity for places like Ohio. So we did include that capacity where Massachusetts waste is going there in any significant quantity. Next slide. For our in-state management, this is a pie chart that reviews the tonnage managed at all the different types of in-state facilities. So I won't go through all of this, but you can see, you know, percentage-wise, how this material is being handled. It adds up to a little over 7 million tons of material managed a year. In-state, you know, the most significant portion going to waste to energy, but then all of these other chunks of material management handling some portion of our waste stream. I would say that I think things like animal feed, that would be food material, food scraps going to animal feed, or reuse are probably somewhat understated in this study data, but we did attempt to account for them. So that's what's happening with the material that's being managed in state. And then next slide, please. When, you know, the big capacity dynamic in Massachusetts, if you don't know this, is most of our landfills are going to be closing soon. So this is our projected landfill capacity over the next decade. And we get down to basically just by the time we get to 2030 or even a little sooner, I believe that's just one active MSW landfill. This doesn't include ash landfills or landfills that maybe are, taking sludge or something like that. This is just landfills that can take MSW or C&D residuals. But this is a big part of our capacity picture. We have known this for some time, that we have rapidly and significantly diminishing in-state projected landfill capacity. Next slide, please. So MSW consultants also looked at where waste materials are going out of state. And this chart summarizes the management of all materials. So this is not just disposal, this is all the forms of management capacity and where it's going out of state. And these columns here just show the number of facilities total by state. They attempted to identify the full permanent capacity of those facilities and the actual amount of waste they received total, then looked at the amount of waste going to those facilities from Massachusetts. And that adds up to total about 1.65 million tons of solid waste going from Massachusetts to out-of-state facilities. Of course, there's also tons going from out-of-state generation into Massachusetts. So this is not a net figure. This is the gross export. So there's some amount coming into Massachusetts as well. Next slide, please. So they also attempted to look at MSW consultants also attempted to look at out-of-state disposal trends. I think my color here, this blue, got a little funky when I copied the slide over, but so that should be for the little legend there, the permanent capacity in tons received. That should be a light green and then a darker green versus the blue. But this shows what states they projected have increasing disposal capacity, either level capacity or decreasing capacity. And again, this was based on the data that was available to them when they were preparing this study in 2018. And I would frame it as a qualitative assessment versus a really detailed, calculated, quantitative assessment. Next slide, please. So this slide I want to emphasize is the conclusions that MSW consultants reached. These are not necessarily our own conclusions, though I wouldn't say I disagree with them, but just as a disclaimer, this is the conclusions that they framed in their study report. So disposal capacity is going to be, from Massachusetts, for Massachusetts, is going to be increasingly reliant on export markets to some degree. That's largely due to our in-state landfills closing. We do have some available capacity in some forms, so this includes our C&D processing capacity. Obviously, that's only useful if those facilities are actually diverting a significant quantity of material from disposal, which we're working on increasing that. There is meaningful capacity for source-separated recoverable materials. In particular, we've had really significant growth in capacity for anaerobic digestion for food material, and we want to make sure we're utilizing that capacity. And then while the reuse sector didn't have a big impact by tonnage in this study, there's of course a lot of value in reuse. And like I referenced a little bit earlier, I do think the reuse numbers in this study are really significantly underestimated because there's so much informal reuse going on. You can't really survey reuse facilities and get a really complete picture like you can with recycling or disposal or even composting. Next slide, please. And so, some of the projections that they highlighted as well. So of course, consistent with the prior slide, exported disposal tonnage, we would expect that to continue to increase. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're trying to address that in a moment. And then clearly more source separation will be necessary to capitalize on the capacity that we do have available, especially the capacity that's not disposal capacity. And then all of these bullet points and the capacity trends point to higher costs for materials management over time in Massachusetts as markets and capacity get more constrained. We would expect that, at least to some degree, to be reflected in increased management costs. The degree to which that may be held down by cheap long haul tip fees is, what kind of remains to be seen. So it's not totally clear how that market dynamic is going to go. But overall, I think we can presume this management is going to cost more over time. So that's what I've got from the summary findings from the MSW consultants report. Now I'm just going to turn really quickly to a couple slides about Massachusetts and what we're doing with capacity. So next slide, please. We are going right now through the process of developing a 2030 solid waste master plan that will guide our solid waste policies for the next decade and beyond that. We are just actually reopening the comment on that right now. We have a reopened comment period through September 15th, where we're seeking more comment on some specific issues. But in the draft plan, we have a pair of disposal reduction goals that kind of build off our current disposal reduction goals. So the first is to reduce our disposal tonnage by 30% by 2030. And this is from a baseline disposal of about 5.7 million tons in 2018 down to 4 million tons by 2030. And then longer term to reduce our disposal by 90% by 2050, which would be all the way down to 570,000 tons on an annual basis. And this is really, really closely tied to our capacity dynamics and how we're trying to address management capacity in Massachusetts. So I'll turn to the next slide for that. So I want to briefly review our policies related to capacity, because the question about all this is really, what can we do about it and what are the ways we can best influence it? So one thing I just need to say to start is that we do not have any capacity-based restrictions on landfill permitting. So if a municipality or a private developer came in with a landfill project that both meets local site assignment criteria and meets our permitting requirements, we would permit it. Fact of the matter is that's not been happening and does not appear likely to happen in Massachusetts, simply because there does not seem to be the space or the willing communities to host a landfill. So we've not seen any movement in that regard, but at the same time, there's no state restriction on permitting landfill capacity if it comes to us. We do have a restriction on permitting additional waste to energy capacity, though we have two proposed modifications to that moratorium. One is actually in place in our current master plan. We would allow up to 350,000 tons per year of alternative waste energy capacity. That would be something other than traditional mass burn capacity. And then we also have proposed a change where we have about 3.2 million tons a year of municipal waste to energy capacity, much of which, or really all of which, came online in the 80s. And so we have added a proposal to say if one of those facilities closes or needs to be, essentially completely rebuilt, we will allow that current capacity to be replaced, which could be at the same location or it could be at a different location. Right now, under our current master plan, that would not be allowed. So that's a modification to try to maintain that existing capacity going forward if one of these facilities decided to close or had to close. So the idea is to try to maintain that capacity. Either of those or both of those would require tighter emissions controls, reassessment of backed air requirements, and then more rigorous separation requirements to ensure that recyclables are being removed to the maximum extent possible. But really, this next bullet is really our primary focus. Is we're trying to maximize all of our other forms of management capacity. We believe, honestly, that's the best way we can influence capacity. Every ton that we can recycle, every ton that we can send to an anaerobic digester, every ton that we can reduce or reuse is ton of disposal capacity that will not be needed. And frankly, we feel like that's the best way we can influence our capacity dynamics. Not that we're not paying attention to disposal capacity, but that's where we think we honestly have the most influence. And that's it for me. I just have one more slide with my contact information and a few links that I can share. This includes a link to the published study that I just went through from MSW Consultants. And then we do our own annual solid waste data updates. So I have a link to 2017 and prior updates. Our 2018 update is an appendix within our draft master plan. And we're working on 2019 data now that we hope to have out this fall. And I will end there and happy to take any questions at the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John, for talking to us about what's happening in Massachusetts. Very much appreciated. We will take questions at the end, but thank you again. And I just wanted to turn the presentation, the panel, over to Mike Nork, who's with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and we're going to forward on to him.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay.
Go right ahead.
All righty. So I will provide a brief overview of disposal capacity in New Hampshire. I'm going to focus mainly on disposal, but I will at the end try to give a little bit of perspective as well on the state's other types of solid waste management capacity. Next slide, please. So just want to give a brief overview of where these facilities are located. New Hampshire has 7 primary disposal facilities. We've got 6 municipal solid waste landfills and 1 commercial waste to energy facility. That's the Wheelabrator Concord Company, which is in Pennacook. And as for the 6 municipal solid waste landfills, 3 of them are commercial. They have unlimited service area, and 3 of them are publicly owned limited service area facilities, meaning they can only take waste from a defined geographic area, whether it's a municipality or a solid waste district. So the 3 commercial facilities are Mount Carberry, which is in Success Township, just outside of Berlin, the North Country Environmental Services Landfill, or NCES, which is in Bethlehem, and the TLR3 landfill, also known as the Turnkey Landfill, which is in Rochester. And then for the 3 limited facilities, there's the Lebanon landfill, which serves the city of Lebanon, as well as a regional area that includes some towns in Vermont, and the lower Mount Washington Valley landfill, which is serving the town of Conway, and finally the Nashua Fort Hills landfill, which serves the city of Nashua. Together, these facilities, including the waste to energy facility, provided disposal for just under 2 million tons of solid waste in 2018. That's the latest data we have available. And that 2 million tons figure does not include alternate daily cover. Of that total amount of disposed waste, roughly 55% came from New Hampshire generators, and the other 45% came from out of state. So we can go to the next slide, please. So there's been questions in recent years, does New Hampshire have a disposal crisis? And the chart depicted here is our disposal capacity projection, which we included in the department's 2019 solid waste report. As soon as we released this, it created some concern among stakeholders about an impending disposal crisis. So I'd like to just take a moment to discuss and hopefully provide a little bit more context for this chart. As you can see, the chart compares two lines. It's got New Hampshire's projected waste disposal need, which is the light purple line, and it compares that against New Hampshire's projected capacity at permitted disposal facilities, which is the dark blue line. So essentially, the purple line represents how much stuff we generate that needs to be disposed, and the dark blue line represents the capacity of New Hampshire's facilities to take that stuff. Next slide, please. And without context, it can certainly be a kind of misleading chart. So, as you can see, it depicts a somewhat limited shortfall starting in 2025, which is when that dark blue line starts to drop below our disposal need. And then a sudden shortfall in capacity around 2034, which is when the turnkey landfill's permitted capacity is expected to be depleted. And upon first glance, this may look like a serious impending crisis. But to understand why the chart shows this shortfall and why it looks the way it does, I just want to talk a little bit about the context and assumptions behind this chart. So go to the next slide, please. So first of all, the chart only represents permitted disposal capacity. And what I mean by that is it does not anticipate or factor in any potential capacity that may exist. Say a facility that has physical space to expand, but hasn't actually obtained a permit for that yet. So we are only considering capacity that has been approved by the department. So it's somewhat limited in scope. The other thing is that we are assuming that these landfills will close at the earliest date allowed by their permit. So we're basically assuming that these facilities will fill at the maximum rate allowed by their permit, regardless of any operational limitations. And so that produces a fairly conservative estimate as well. And third, I just want to point out that the state statute, RSA 149M, which is our Solid Waste Management Act, requires capacity planning to be done over a 20-year period. So that requires us to look at and project capacity over that 20-year period, which has indirect influence on how we permit facilities in the state. And lastly, I just want to point out that capacity projections, like the chart that we saw in the previous slide, will always probably show a capacity shortfall within any 20-year period. And that's primarily because landfills constitute the majority of our capacity for disposal, and landfills expand incrementally. So they're not looking for 20 or 30 years of capacity at a time. Generally speaking, they're looking at 10, maybe 15 years at a time. So that's not going to fill up, in all cases, it's not going to fill up that 20-year planning period. Next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways from that chart? What is the status of disposal capacity in New Hampshire? Well, first, I just want to point out, at the current time, New Hampshire has enough capacity to meet its disposal needs. And although the chart does indicate a shortfall, starting in 2025, we don't necessarily anticipate an impending crisis. As stated previously, landfills expand incrementally, and a shortfall within the planning period is not unexpected. It's important to remember, that capacity for disposal evolves over time. And so this 2019 chart is simply a snapshot of that evolving scenario. Landfills routinely request capacity expansions. We anticipate that will continue into the future. And as a matter of fact, DES is currently reviewing expansion requests from a couple facilities. But again, that activity won't be captured in our capacity projections unless and until those expansions are permitted. And lastly, it's worth noting that permitting additional disposal capacity is really only one way to address the state's capacity needs. I think it's arguably more important to focus our energies on lowering our disposal need. In other words, reducing the amount of waste that we send to landfills and incinerators. And this can be done by supplanting disposal capacity with other types of capacity like recycling or composting capacity or other forms of diversion, and obviously also reduction of the amount of waste we generate in the first place. Next slide, please. So let's talk just briefly about other forms of management capacity in New Hampshire. Besides the disposal capacity we have from landfills primarily, as well as our waste to energy facility, the bulk of the state's waste management capacity is from our network of transfer facilities. So we have over 200 public and private transfer stations, as well as over 25 scrap metal facilities, which altogether function primarily as throughput facilities, receiving waste and then transferring it to either disposal at a landfill or to other authorized facilities for further processing or recycling or other management. In terms of processing capacity in New Hampshire, we have, as I mentioned, the one waste to energy facility in Pennacook. We also have 2 C&D processing facilities, which sorts the C&D stream to recover and recycle as much as possible. Those facilities together in 2018 managed about 300,000 tons of C&D waste. I think about half of that came from Massachusetts. And then there's also one soils treatment facility which treats contaminated soils. As for composting capacity in New Hampshire, regrettably, it's not where we'd like it to be. It's somewhat limited at this time. There's about 6 operating composting facilities that have a solid waste permit. And so they provide some capacity, although it is admittedly limited. And then in terms of single stream processing capacity, there are no commercial MRFs in New Hampshire materials recovery facilities. So single stream recycling in the state of New Hampshire is typically sent to Massachusetts or to Vermont or Maine for processing at their MRFs. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you see the solid waste management hierarchy for the state of New Hampshire. And so comparing that hierarchy to what the reality of our infrastructure looks like, there's a little bit of a disconnect because the solid waste management hierarchy puts emphasis on diversion, but arguably diversion is the weakest part of New Hampshire's solid waste management infrastructure. So yeah, our recycling infrastructure and composting infrastructure is fairly limited. And besides the recycling capacity that's provided by the state's transfer stations and a handful of processing facilities, our infrastructure is unfortunately heavily tilted towards disposal and use of landfills. So it's fair to say New Hampshire doesn't have a landfill capacity crisis. Instead, we have a shortage of other types of solid waste management that would be more preferred by the hierarchy. So I think this is New Hampshire's real impending crisis. And the department would love to see more processing capacity for C&D, recyclables, organics, et cetera. However, our ability to influence development of these types of infrastructure is limited. Essentially, we react to permit applications we receive. And over the past 25 or so years, requests for landfill capacity have predominated. And that's perhaps partly due to a lack of statewide planning and a lack of public assistance resources or other incentives that might drive development of more preferential management capacity. So this is certainly an area of concern for DES. In the short term, we intend to work on the state's solid waste management plan. We're looking to incorporate more specificity in the plan regarding how a facility must demonstrate public benefit to meet the disposal needs or the solid waste management needs of residents and businesses in the state. And we hope that providing additional guidance will aid driving development that is consistent with the hierarchy. So that's something that we'll hopefully be working on over the coming year. We'll go to the next slide, please. And I just wanted to close by noting that there's some additional resources for those that are interested. The first there is the solid waste report that we issued back in 2019, which is where that chart that I showed earlier, that's where that came from. as well as a report that was issued by a legislative study committee that was formed last summer that looked at solid waste and recycling practices in New Hampshire. So it just gives a general overview of their findings as well as some context for current status of solid waste management in New Hampshire. And you've got my contact information there too as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your presentation. And thank you, all three of you, Jeff, John, and Mike. And I just wanted to open for questions. We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to open for questions. And let's see, first question we have in, if everybody could unmute their microphone. What has prevented, the question came in, what has prevented New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont from adopting residential and commercial pay-as-you-throw incentives for decreasing waste disposal?
I can jump in for New Hampshire. Just in terms of a statewide requirement for pay-as-you-throw, I think there hasn't been any legislative activity to, bring that for New Hampshire. However, the current statute does enable individual towns to adopt a pay-as-you-throw policy, but there is no requirement for that to be implemented on a statewide level.
Okay.
So I can add for Massachusetts, though I think it's a similar picture. So for us to have a requirement for statewide pay-as-you-throw on either residential or commercial, that would require legislation to be passed, and that is generally not our role. Our role is to implement legislation. So what we have done is we have worked quite a bit through grant and assistance programs to increase the number of municipalities that adopt pay-as-you-throw. That's a decision that's made at the local level, but we support it through grants and technical assistance. And we have in the neighborhood of 150 communities with pay-as-you-throw that represent roughly about a third of our population.
Yeah, Heather, this is Jeff. So in Vermont, through those solid waste implementation plans, it is a requirement. I shouldn't say requirement, but all the municipalities are pay-as-you-throw. I also just, something I missed a mark on before, is that state of Vermont also, I mean, we have the landfill capacity, but we're pretty aggressive on reducing the waste. Recently we had the organics ban of organics in the landfill, so all organics are banned from the landfill. We have active C&D recycling. If there's recycling facility, any construction within 20 miles of that facility generating over 40 cubic yards needs to go to that facility for recycling. And then any construction Act 250 project in the state of Vermont over 5,000 square feet, they need to have an active solid waste plan, which is reviewed for waste reduction for the construction of that building.
Excellent. Thank you all for contributing. I have a question that came in for New Hampshire. It says, driving through Bethlehem this past weekend, I saw yard signs saying, "Save our waste manager," and further text saying it will save $3 to $4 million. Any context for these signs? Mike?
I can honestly say I'm not familiar with what that's referring to. I do note that the town of Bethlehem, I believe, has been having conversations recently about what they might do for a transfer station for the town if the NCES landfill were to close, because that facility currently provides a transfer station for residents of the town. So maybe it's in reference to that, but that's just a guess.
And pay attention to your road size. Interesting. We have another question coming in from Massachusetts. It says, why is Massachusetts closing its landfills? Have concerns been raised about the financial and emissions impacts of shipping MSW so far away, like Ohio?
So, first of all, we are not closing our landfills, they're filling up. And, these are landfills operated by either private entities or municipalities. They have permits to fill to a certain level. If it's, possible from an engineering perspective, they could certainly come in for an expansion and request more capacity, but it's really not so much that we're saying we're going to close these landfills, it's that the landfills are filling up and running out of space. We do not determine where waste is sent. That's a market decision. So whether it goes to Ohio or somewhere else is really determined by, regional disposal markets. And it's not like Mass DEP is determining specifically where the waste goes. The only, and I think this for all of us comes back to what can we do to influence capacity. So, we have certain approaches to permitting solid waste facilities, but then, like I said, we have other ways we can influence capacity through getting as much material as recycled and composted as possible. And our waste characterization studies in Massachusetts show that in the neighborhood of 40% of our trash is materials that are banned from disposal. So while we know we can't get every ton of that out, we believe we can get a lot more of that diverted and really substantially influence our, reduce our need for disposal capacity through that route.
Sure. And if I may go back to something Mike from New Hampshire said, he said it's really not so much a disposal capacity crisis that New Hampshire might have, but it's really a crisis about how can we reduce waste, the recycling industry and organics, et cetera. So I want to ask the question to all three of you. How can you explain your agency's solid waste staffing and education is funded? So talking about education.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I can go first. So state of Vermont has a franchise fee, which is a fee of $6 a ton, which also could be called a tax, on all waste that's disposed of in Vermont or any waste that's generated in Vermont and shipped out of state. And that also includes waste that's imported. So it's $6 a ton, and that covers the solid waste management program as well as grant money for new projects, HHW collection events, and education.
Excellent, thanks. Any others?
So in Massachusetts, the bulk of our programs, and especially all of our recycling grant and assistance programs, are funded by a unique category of waste to energy credits in Massachusetts, renewable energy credits that are earned by municipal waste to energy facilities. And part of the requirements on those credits is that they have to take 50% of the value of the credits that they sell and put that into a fund that supports the grant and assistance programs that we run in Massachusetts. And that has been, for a number of years now, that has been our primary funding source for all of our programs.
Okay.
And for New Hampshire, the Solid Waste Management Bureau at DES is somewhat unique compared to other states in that we don't have any dedicated funding source for solid waste management or education and outreach or regulation or regulatory programs. We are 100% general funded, which is the type of money that's hardest to come by, especially now with budget crunch here in the state and other states relative to COVID-19, obviously, and other budget concerns. So the department has been somewhat under-resourced for the past couple decades. We used to have an education and outreach program, but due to successive cuts to our staffing and our budget, those positions were eliminated. So currently, we really only have, funding from general funds to allow us to permit facilities and assure compliance for those facilities. We don't have any function for outreach, education, or planning. I just want to note that that study committee that I mentioned on my last slide, that was formed by the legislature last summer, they became aware of this issue, and one of the recommendations they made was that New Hampshire adopt a similar fee to what other states are doing, a fee assessed on disposal that would then be used as a dedicated fund to help advance planning efforts and education and outreach, and also provide grant opportunities to advance recycling and diversion in the state.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for your answers. That's all the time we have for now. Hopefully you'll tune in to our legislative updates concerning education. I wanted to first thank our sponsors for the summer webinar series, Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. And I'll remind everyone that a survey will launch immediately after this webinar. It'll also appear in your email one day later. As a reminder, we welcome feedback. And what's coming up, we have Food Too Good to Waste, a webinar from Brenna Toman, Zero Waste School Coordinator, on Friday at noon to 1. And then next Wednesday, we have our own Executive Director, Regan Bissonnette, with Maddie Delono, a graduate student from UNH, speaking about using processed glass aggregate in road and infrastructure projects. So thank you all, and have a happy summer from NRRA.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.